All right, well, hello. Welcome back to the videos. What I'm going to be discussing today in this video are the two transcriptions of talks given by the noted Zen Buddhist teacher Charlotte Joko Beck, who passed away in 2011. Just a friendly reminder that you should have already read those before watching this video. So, the talks I provided you with were given in the 1980s, and let me just begin by just calling back to the Mystery Science TED Talk 3000, The Paradox of Choice, the Next Generation presentation, which you saw in a previous module, because in that presentation, right, I gave a very brief recap of the basic foundation of Buddhism, right? And that, of course, is known as the Four Noble Truths. The first of which, right, is that life is dissatisfactory, or life is suffering, different ways to put that. And then it continues with the idea that the cause of this dissatisfactoriness or suffering is craving or desire. And that, in the end, is caused by impermanence. Next, we get to the third noble truth, where we basically derive the inference that, well, look, to cease suffering from this dissatisfaction, we need to simply stop craving or desiring. And so finally then, a solution is offered. The way to stop craving is to follow the Noble Eightfold Path. And we're not going to get into all the details of the Noble Eightfold Path here, just as I didn't before, but just suffice it to say that the Noble Eightfold Path offers a variety of prescriptions for how to live one's life in a way that will enable you to stop craving things. It's not an easy road, and it can easily take a lifetime or more, considering the Buddhist belief in rebirth. But you might be asking, or in fact you should be asking, what does any of this have to do with personal identity? And we're going to get into that next by looking at the first essay that I wanted you to read, which is curiously titled, New Jersey Does Not Exist. So a key to Beck's understanding of who we are is that, quote, and I'm going to quote from these essays quite a bit here, but, quote, "We assume that reality is as we see it and that it is fixed and unchanging." This is from page 163. Now, as a Buddhist, right, the point here is that it is clearly not, right? When we talked about in the Four Noble Truths impermanence, this is the realization that nothing is permanent. Everything is constantly undergoing change. Nothing is fixed whatsoever. So she takes that for granted as a Buddhist. But let's also remember that belief is not unique to Buddhism. Remember that Plato argued that the fact that the world was constantly undergoing change was a reason to believe there had to be a world of unchanging forms. Now, of course, this world of unchanging forms, which, as we remember, Plato argues is really only accessible to philosophers, to people who can use reason in a very sophisticated way. This idea of a world of forms is certainly where Beck and all Buddhists would diverge from Plato. Beck, and Buddhists in general, would also go beyond this belief that everything is impermanent and unchanging, because she is quite clear in her belief that there are, in fact, no separate existences. As she states on page 163, quote, "A powerful microscope would reveal that the reality we encounter is not truly separate from us." So, in other words, we believe New Jersey exists over there on the East Coast. We believe that Mike Van Quickenborne exists over here, or over there, over here, over there, both places, at the college. But just as Beck saw from an airplane, the land just keeps going on between states, and you and I are not completely separate either, as she argues, right, would be revealed by a powerful microscope. As she succinctly puts it, quote, "In fact, these boundaries are arbitrary." So I know I'm here at a cemetery, and we have tombstones here about in a cemetery, as is typical. And this might suggest that, people think, well, no, we're these individual people. We get a place that we are buried in. But what Beck is saying is that ultimately we are not separate from one another. And in fact, perhaps to some extent, we can recognize this in a cemetery because underneath these tombstones, of course, are the remains of a human being. And ultimately, they're just dissolving back into the earth, right? And the earth over here is no different from the earth over there. In essence, maybe cemeteries reveal that we are all interconnected at a fundamental level. So, to bring this to the question of personal identity, Beck wants us to recognize that, quote, the reality that we live in needs us to function in certain ways. To do this, we must be distinct from things around us, right? In other words, society needs us to have separate tombstones, if you want to put it that way. Society needs us to think of ourselves as separate individuals from one another. But, of course, she's going to argue that's not the ultimate reality, right? Another way to put it, perhaps more directly for college students, right? In order to attend Everett Community College, you have to have a distinct student identification number so that grades and eventually a degree can be awarded to the person associated with that number. But what's going on there, as she puts it, and I'm going to quote again from page now 166, is that we've created a false world pasted on top of the real one. In other words, we confuse the map with reality itself. Now, by doing this, as she notes, we are able to make our way in society, or as she puts it, we are able to, quote, play this wonderful game we are in, unquote. But the problem is, when we're doing that, to quote from her again, we're not playing the real game. This is from page 166. Put another way, Beck is arguing that we don't know who we are and what we're doing. Now, just as with the Four Noble Truths, she is not simply offering a critical or philosophical account of personhood. Her main goal is to help us live better lives. As she suggests, quote, if New Jersey does not have to exist as a separate entity, it doesn't have to defend itself, unquote. And if we don't have to exist as separate entities from one another, then we don't have to have the kind of conflict that we're all too familiar with in this day and age. Now, just as we saw with the Tao Te Ching, so we can go back to that as well, Lao Tzu, in its recommendation that we pay close attention to nature, remember that, and especially water, Beck recommends a model for us to think about here as well. In this case, what she directs our attention to are white blood cells. What is important about white blood cells is that they do not get confused about their purpose. As she puts it on page 167, quote, the white blood cell does not ask, what is the meaning of life? It knows. The problem for humans is that, to quote from her again, page 165, so the problem for humans is that we've cut ourselves off from the problem. With all our thinking, reacting, analyzing, we can't solve it. Now at this point, notice a remarkable difference between Beck and René Descartes. Unlike with the rationalist Descartes, for Beck, thinking and analyzing get in the way of solving our problems. They're not the solution to our problems, as Descartes argues. Similarly, she says that, quote, our body has its own wisdom. It's the misuse of our brain that screws up our lives, unquote, from page 164. Again, we just learned that Descartes argues that the mind, or what Beck is calling the brain here, Descartes argues that the mind is who we truly are, but she's going to flip that argument on its head and argues that it is our body that ought to direct our lives. In fact, and now to turn to relationship is not to each other, the second essay here that I gave you to look at, we can see Beck's continuing disagreement with Descartes' dualistic way of thinking about who we are when she argues at the very beginning of this essay, quote, we have a mind and body, but those elements don't explain the life we are. unquote. And so again, let's pause for a moment and reflect on the fact that, or just maybe not reflect, but remember that Descartes' view definitely has its problems. And one way to put that is to consider that it's very difficult to think of ourselves as either a mind or a body. Those concepts are inadequate to the task of understanding personhood. So, as any good philosopher would say, Beck notes that what we want to know, right, and what we're doing here in this class, and specifically in this module, talking about the nature of the self, is we want to know our true self, from page 97. As we just heard from Beck, though, rationality, using our brain, is not the way to come to know our true self, right? So she's not doing, in a certain sense, a philosophical project here. Beck's guidance, right, and this is, of course, the crux of her advice to us, Beck's guidance is to sit session. That's S-E-S-S-H-I-N, right? That's that word you see there in that second essay. And to sit session means to sit for meditation very intensively all day long. So this is a very intensive day-long meditation session. Now, this kind of meditation, emptying the mind for an extended period, right? Completely trying to separate ourselves from our rationality. She would argue, and she's arguing here, this allows us to discuss our true self. Now, how would she, someone who has done this type of meditation for a long time, describe our true self? Well, she says it consists in, quote, the functioning of a man or a woman in which there is no self-centered motivation. Such a person would be fully human, from page 98. Furthermore, such a person would actually be nobody at all, from page 98. Okay, I'm going to read that again because I kind of flubbed it. Such a person would actually be nobody at all. So, before we move on with that, notice again how far we have come from Descartes. Right? Descartes was convinced that the one thing each of us could count on was that we exist and are a thinking thing. But here, Beck is arriving at the claim that, and now to quote from her again, quote, essentially, the true self is nobody, or no thing is actually the words she uses there, right? Essentially, the true self is no thing. Nothing, in other words. So to expand on that idea, we have to go back to a point that just as would be revealed by a powerful microscope, we are not separate from anything else around us. Thus, to say that we are this thing over here, separate from something or someone else over there, is pasting an arbitrary map over reality. So, in reality, no things can be separated from anything else, and thus there are no things in reality, or, right, no things meaning nothing. In other words, the point she's arriving at here is that nothing exists, including the self. None of this is to say that I don't have a relationship with you, but when we speak in this way, we are simply using what she calls everyday language. At the same time, as she tells us on page 98, true self knows no separation. So we can hopefully disentangle this tension between everyday language and reality by remembering Berkeley, right? George Berkeley. Remember, as far as Berkeley was concerned, we are not justified in saying that any properties, like color, how something feels to our touch, or even shape or solidity, none of these properties in here, right, exists in objects themselves, because all properties are purely subjective, right? They purely exist in the mind. At the same time, in our everyday lives, we would of course refer to red, quote-unquote, apples, right? Red apples and the like. But deeper reflection, right, which is what Berkeley wants us to do, have deeper reflection on the nature of reality, deeper reflection, which is of course also what sitting session is all about, right? That's why we sit session, to come to know the true nature of reality. So Berkeley would say that deeper reflection requires us to understand that we can't talk about a red apple existing in physical reality outside of our minds. The same way, sitting session will enable us to come to know the true self, as Beck calls it. So to wrap this up, right, the good news, as Beck is trying to tell us, is that once we have realized our true self, once we have let go of our self-centered preoccupation, we can know our purpose, and we will have clarity in our lives rather than confusion, rather than irritation, conflict, and suffering. That would be good news to Descartes, of course, right, who starts off his meditations in one of those states of confusion, right? She's obviously providing a different avenue to resolve that emotional turmoil. Now, whether Beck is correct, of course, is another question, but I hope that you've at least gotten some idea as to her understanding of the nature of the self.